Lots to talk about today on the podcast as we survey the global disorder. And today we're going to go south to Venezuela, where opposition parties held an unofficial referendum yesterday on the Maduro government's efforts to rewrite that nation's constitution and cement Maduro, the dictator strongman, in place for years to come. Nearly 7 million Venezuelans inside the country came out to vote. They voted overwhelmingly against the government, a remarkable display of human courage, and I'm very happy to welcome our America's columnist, Mary Anastasia O'Grady, to discuss. Hi, Mary.
Hi.
Great to be with you. I want to set aside just for a moment whether or not this referendum is going to do anything, but just a remark on how courageous these people are to get out on the streets, given nearly 100 people have been murdered by the Maduro regime. You had a 61-year-old woman killed at a polling station just yesterday, 4 more people wounded by the pro-government thugs. Really a remarkable display of courage.
Yeah, I was very impressed by it. Prior to the vote, I was a little bit worried because they didn't have much time to put it together, and they also don't have much in the way of resources. It's very hard to get dollars in the country. The currency is completely destroyed. So just from a purely organizational standpoint, it was a challenge. And then, as you say, the other problem was that between the National Guard, the Bolivarian police, and the civilian-clothed enforcers that are known as colectivos by the government, it's very dangerous to go out on those kinds of days. And there was one woman killed in Katia. And it was by a group of colectivos who were, basically acting as enforcers for the government. And yet people turned out. And I think a big part of that is just the level of desperation. I've written in my column before that I think that they've hit a point where there's just no going back. Over the years they've had protests, but the protests have died down and so forth. And I think because of the food shortages, they've reached a point where they feel quite desperate. And yesterday, in some sense, it was courageous, but it was also a display of the desperation that the nation feels.
When I saw the vote, I was reminded of my time in Hong Kong, where the government used to say, yeah, we know what the people want. We're going to solicit input on democracy. And then they would kind of selectively take submissions from pro-Beijing groups and then declare that actually, Hong Kongers don't really want democracy. But it just goes to show, doesn't it, that you never really know for sure unless people can go into the polling booth in the secrecy of the polling booth and tell you exactly what they want.
Well, actually, I think in this case, because Hong Kong may be a little bit different, but in this case, I think it's pretty well known that something around 80% of the country opposes the current government. Now, that doesn't mean that they all want to return to, a free market economy or go to a free market economy. I think a number of those people are people who were great supporters of Hugo Chávez, and they feel like Nicolas Maduro, who is currently running the country, has betrayed the revolution. Now, of course, what they don't know, because probably, the information doesn't flow very easily in Venezuela, but the big difference between Maduro and Chávez is the fall in oil prices. Chávez enjoyed $100 barrel oil, and, the Venezuelan oil sells at a discount to even West Texas Intermediate. So the country is just significantly poorer than it was solely because of the price of oil. And then also if you layer on top of that, the breakdown in the actual production of the oil because the wells haven't been maintained. They haven't done exploration and development over the years. There's been a huge amount of corruption, so the money that should have gone to bringing up more oil has gone into the pockets of the criminal government. So people are widely unhappy with this. I think that the idea of the referendum was to actually document it. And as you say, it was an extremely courageous moment, display of determination that people have that they need to change this government.
You know, a lot of listeners out there might not know or might wonder why the Maduro regime has not fallen already, given the desperation that you've just talked about, Mary. And your column today, I thought was wonderful, very revealing, titled "How Cuba Runs Venezuela." Folks out there who want to read it can go to wsj.com/opinion. And you document in there how Havana props up the Maduro regime. And some of the numbers here I think are worth repeating. You quote a source, Roberto Alvarez Quiñones, who says there are almost, and I'm quoting here, 50 high-ranking Cuban military officers, 4,500 Cuban soldiers in 9 battalions, and 34,000 doctors and health professionals with orders to defend the tyranny with arms. It sounds like Venezuela has just become a Cuban proxy state. Am I overstating that, Mary?
Yeah, no, you're not. In fact, if I were to explain why he has not fallen, I would say, well, there's a 4-letter word that explains that, and it's Cuba. They are, basically using a Soviet-style apparatus to control information. And if you cannot communicate, which the best chance of some sort of either peaceful or non-peaceful bringing down the dictatorship would be when the military becomes unhappy.
Right.
And certainly there are numerous soldiers and officers who are unhappy with the terrible poverty that they have created with the system. But those officers and soldiers cannot communicate, and the reason is because the military is completely infiltrated with Cuban state security, intelligence, counterintelligence, and so forth. And so if one person talks and they're heard by Cuba, by one of these agents, they are carted away. And the fear factor is quite significant. And without being able to communicate, you can't organize. And without being able to organize, you can't make a play for the Miraflores Palace, which is where the head of the government is. I don't like to say president, but
yeah, well,
he's head of the government.
Head of the government. Yeah, it's remarkable that this is all happening just a couple hours flight from Miami. You know, the timing here of this referendum that was held is also important because the Maduro government is going to hold a constituent assembly on July 30th to essentially rewrite the Constitution. Mary, judging from your remarks here about the extent to which Cuba props up this regime, it sounds like that assembly will go ahead. A question I have is, if they do, it sounds like we're going to see even more protests and more blood in the streets.
Well, the main reason for this assembly is basically to be able to, use quote-unquote legal means. They'll say that, well, we have this assembly and the assembly has decided to shut down the National Assembly, which is the unicameral legislature. And that's what Maduro wants to do because the legislature is in the hands of the opposition. And this has been a problem for him. They, as you know, in democracies, different branches of government check the power of other branches. That's normal, and he doesn't like that. So that's the purpose of his holding these elections, and they would elect representatives who would then be charged with drafting this new constitution, which would be the final death knell for any kind of pluralism in the country. And so, as you say, it looks like they'll probably go ahead with it, but it's just like the referendum yesterday doesn't solve anything because Cuba's in charge. The National Assembly won't change the fact that people are in the streets extremely unhappy and that the country is facing famine. I mean, people, the statistics show that people are losing a lot of weight. The average Venezuelan has lost more than 10 pounds. That's sort of an average, so it's very hard to measure. But I think in the rural areas, it's much more difficult because what people don't understand is they think about food, but food requires a distribution network. And there are no automotive parts.
Great shortages of supplies, automotive parts, and all of this in a country that used to be one of the richest in Latin America.